No, I'll just,
Sorry.
Okay. So just procedurally, Noel, you were appointed as an alternate, and so in those meetings where there is a regular planning board member missing, you in theory could be a voting member. However, tonight, the issue that, well, the principal issue that we're going to be discussing is, has been in the works for quite a long time. We've had the hearing and so forth. So I would assume that you would recuse yourself from a vote on that because of the fact that you're just joining the planning board now. But you're welcome to participate in the discussion, and I welcome you to do that. So first on the agenda, you all saw from Chip's agenda and his emails that Sincarfa Sola has come in looking for an extension to their approval for the solar project on Main Street. The standard conditions of approval in the LUO require that construction of an approved project has to be substantially started within a year. And if it isn't, the applicant can apply for a one-year extension. And that's what Sincarfa is requesting at this point. So it's a relatively simple decision if the board wants to approve that one-year extension to give them additional opportunity to begin substantial construction of the project. That a vote to approve the extension would allow them to proceed in that way. So, Chip?
Yes, I just wanted to email yesterday, I believe, that Sincarfa has now provided us with the one piece that's been missing, why they couldn't start, and that is the decommissioning bond. I believe I sent that all to you yesterday. And so right now, I'm able to issue them a building permit. And for everybody's information, there was a lot of discussion that went on through all of this about whether they should have to salute the new ordinance or not. We decided that was not necessary, as was written in the approval. So the 2 points I just bring up are, number one, they finally came through the last item needed, and that is the decommissioning bond, and that now it's up to them and CMP to get going.
The language in the standard condition, however, it talks about a substantial start on the project itself. So that would be the basis for the extension that we would be issuing. I don't remember what the date was. I forgot to check that, but it was an October date from last year, as I recall. So the one year would be at some point in October, and I think it's rather doubtful that at this point they would have made a substantial start by that date in October. So it's great that they got the bond in. That's good. That will help them along, but I still think we need to address this issue of an extension.
So I'll make a motion to extend the permit another year.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, motion and a second. Discussion.
Yeah, I just comment that I would rather see this go with a year extension rather than them rushing to get a substantial start this fall. So I think it would be wise for us to grant this.
Okay.
I have a question for clarification.
Yes. No.
Are we in full attendance for the actual board members?
We are missing one board member. A full board is 7, and one of the regular members is not here tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, motion and a second to grant the 1-year extension. And I will take a vote. Jack,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Jan,
Yes.
Bill,
Yes.
Henry,
Yes.
and Noel. Are you comfortable voting on this one?
I'm going to abstain today.
Okay.
I'd say mostly because I need to be sworn in.
Oh, you haven't been sworn in. Okay.
No, I did
All
not
right, I
make it
didn't
through
realize
today.
that. Okay. And Paula, yes. The second agenda item is, Chip, you can talk to us about this. I think that in terms of this issue tonight, I'm not expecting that we're going to reach any resolution on it. I think that we might have an offline conversation about how to advise them to proceed. But my understanding from you was that you wanted to put the issue in front of the planning board so we were aware of it. We can talk about it offline, and I think probably Henry is most likely to to have comment on it specifically. So we can spend a few minutes on it and see where it stands. And so, Chip, if you want to talk about that.
Well, I think we're here in a work session to discuss everything that's been presented to the group and come to some kind of clarity where everybody understands all the points that have been brought up, been presented to us. We had some late application from the Safe House group that originally
Excuse me, Chip, I'm sorry. I was talking about the other solar issue. I thought you wanted to talk about that first. I wasn't into safe space yet.
Forgive me, Madam Chairman. This week, we had a applicant come in for a discussion. He is one of these groups that come in and put up a medium-sized solar farm. This one, for example, would be 600 kilowatts, and it would be set up on Kent's Hill School grounds to supply the power needs of the whole school. I was called by this group, and they wanted to know there's a certain part of this, our ordinance, that would be in their way. And again, as a medium scale project in our ordinance, I believe it requires equipment to be real property in town. You know, you can discuss that, tell me why that was done. I wasn't a part of that at the time, but according to the applicant that will be coming to us, he was quoting section 7, item 3, the deed registration for the project. This is a power purchase agreement, and it limits the ID to personal property. Nonprofit schools, towns take advantage of this so they can get power. But with our ordinance, I guess the way that they set this up, they are not able to do it as tax property. So we will need to discuss with them when they come to us, and I'm looking for direction from the board. Are we willing to look at the ordinance and see how they can work around it? As they mentioned that they're working with Kent's Hill feverishly to get this done. This would not be set up to sell to the grid. If there was any extra power, it would be put in the grid, but this goes into the grid from their project, and then the school buys back the power for them, I guess, at no cost. But the one sticking point here, again, is for a mid-sized project. And they need to, we ask them to make it real property, either the property of Kent's Hill or this company, and they can't do that according to both. So what I suggest is that y'all think about it, be open to it, and we invite them in for a presentation. I used to call it a pre-application, where they could come in, make a presentation, the board could hear it, make comments. None of the comments would be in the record for the actual hearing of it. That's one suggestion by me. The other suggestion is they just come in with a presentation, but they're kind of hesitant to do that until they know how the board feels about maybe working something around that one piece of the ordinance.
Hey, Henry, what is the reason for this provision that the system has to be incorporated into the description of the real property and registered with the Registry of Deeds?
Yeah, it's not supposed to be, first of all, it's not supposed to be restrictive in any way. So I think it's very clear, it's important to make it clear that that's not the intent of that particular clause. I would also say that there's more than multiple, a plethora of PPA models and arrangements between developers and landowners, and including public landowners and public property. So I think it's worth a little more discussion and thought. I can't really react. I can say that the ordinance, those particular components of the ordinance, as they all are, there's nothing unusual about those. They're fairly standard ordinance clauses that are in other solar ordinances throughout the state of Maine. So, I can understand from a developer's perspective, they may view it that way. That is their interpretation. I think I need to do a little more thinking, and I'm sure our counsel can also help us with that as well. But I don't think, I think the bottom line is it's not supposed to be restrictive. It's supposed to be. So to answer your question, Jack, sorry, that was a long way around answering your question, but your question, the concept would be that any kind of infrastructure goes with the land in case there's a change of property ownership on with the property, right? And so therefore it needs to be in the deed, or at least deeded, so that this is not like a little, it's like a giant building basically, even though it's a solar structure.
Okay.
Okay,
So
thanks.
Chip, you can put that on a future agenda, and we can have a fuller conversation about that, but it sounds like it may not be as problematic as you were initially believing it could be.
I had no beliefs. Again, this was presented to me. They're anxious to get in and work with Kent Hill. I said, we have a board that's open to listening. So again, my only question was, did you want to do a pre-application or just go to it? And from what I'm hearing from you is get them in here and put in an application. And speak with you.
Not that I want to take more time, but since Chip has going to have a conversation, he may talk to Eric. I would make a suggestion, and that is if they're talking to Kensal School, they also might talk to the RSU 38. They may see if there's a way to share that power agreement a little bit. They're both they're both in that same kind of structure. That may be an opportunity for the town. You have limited land, but you can share power wherever it can go. What's going on here?
Okay.
Okay, thank you
Sorry,
very
one
much.
more. May I?
Yes, no.
I was seeking to see a copy of our solar ordinance, and I don't see it in our land. Where would I find that on our website?
I
It's
can
under
send it.
ordinance. It's under the list of ordinances down in the S.
Oh, okay.
It's not part of the LUO right now. It will be soon.
God willing.
Thank you.
Okay, so the principal agenda item for tonight is to begin our deliberation on the Safe Space Meeting House application. As you'll all recall, we conducted a site visit on the 24th of August, and the hearing was held on the 25th. A lot of public comments came in. The deadline for public comment was the 7th of September. Our town attorney is here this evening to help in this conversation, Kristen Collins. I think you all know her, but if you don't, this is Kristen down in the left-hand corner. This evening, she and I have discussed an approach to this conversation and the format that we would use to try to bring some organization to this discussion. This is, as you know, a pretty complicated application. It's controversial. The property itself, there's a lot of history around the property. And, I really believe that it's important for everyone to contribute to this conversation, share your views. It will be important ultimately when we make a final decision as a board on this application. I'm not anticipating a vote and a decision this evening. We'll have a discussion of the issues, and there are a plethora of them, to borrow Henry's word. I think that possibly our conversation tonight can lead to some general direction on how we want to approach this, and may give us a start on actually developing some findings of fact around this that we would use in a decision. Those findings of fact would be something that would be drafted following this meeting and would be reviewed and discussed further at a subsequent meeting. So basically the process that we've discussed going forward for this evening is to talk first of all about a number of very significant issues that were raised during the hearing and the public comment process. And I've got a list of those that we can talk about in just a minute. And then we'll get to the other issues and standards that are related to the site review standards, because as you know, the site review criteria all apply to this application. And there are a number of other standalone standards that are in the ordinance that also apply to the application that are not specifically part of the site review process. Our process will be to talk about those issues and to make some determination on each of them, whether or not they meet the applicable standards in the ordinance. Ultimately, we would go back to the beginning of those lists of standards and take a vote on each of them as a board about whether or not the standard has been met for any particular criterion. And as I mentioned, hopefully our conversation tonight can take us to a place where we're able, with Kristen's help, to craft some findings of fact. And those would be discussed in a subsequent meeting. And ultimately, we would vote on those findings of fact and eventually make a final decision on the application as a whole. I don't know where this discussion will take us, and it's unclear to me, and at this point, if we might accomplish all of that in one more meeting, or if we'll need more than one meeting to do it. That's something we can talk about when we see how much progress we've made this evening in particular. There's no reason that it has to be done at the next meeting. And if it is important for any reason to take more time in order to get it done properly, then I think we should discuss that. I do think it's important to say too that, ultimately there will be opportunity to review any decisions that we make about the criteria tonight. to talk again about any of the issues that come up in our discussions this evening. I think that it's definitely important that collectively we have enough time to fully consider this and to reflect on any agreements or votes that we take in order to get it right. So that time, I think we need to provide for that. There are a lot of moving parts to this application, as everyone knows, and I think that we may not all agree on every piece of it. But ultimately, whatever decisions we make will be reflective of the collective will of the board. But I think that there is certainly potential for there not to be complete agreement about every piece of this application, every standard, and every determination about whether the standards have been met or not. Are there any comments? Would you like to add anything? Any questions about moving forward this evening and how we're going to approach that? If there's any piece of this that that you don't think works, or if you have other ideas about how we might approach it, please feel free to speak up and offer that.
I think that sounds like a good plan, Paula. It's a difficult topic to go through. I would just ask, is there anybody from the applicant here? Oh, I see. Is there anybody from the applicant here tonight, in case we have a question?
There's two members that are about to sit
Okay.
at the table.
They're hiding in the back there. I see them now. Thank you. Camera's not wide enough.
You, so we can-
I'm Alex Bora. I'm Leah Hayes. Can you guys hear us? Can we just establish that first? Can you hear us okay?
For the most part, it's kind of echoey, but it's not just you, it's everyone on the town office side. It's a little difficult to hear you clearly, but I think we'll muddle through. As I mentioned, there are several issues that have been identified that are broad umbrella issues, not related to a specific site review standard, but things that do show up in the ordinance. They're broad standards that are applicable to this particular proposal. And some of these issues, most of them actually, are issues on which we receive comment during the comment period and during the hearing. I guess the first one that I would put on the table to start with and to begin discussion around is the general matter of the proposed uses of the property, and as that relates to the table of uses in the ordinance and the broader zoning scheme that the ordinance puts forward. The proposal is for a community center club, as you know. The ordinance provides a specific definition of community center club, which is on page 120 of the land use ordinance. It talks about a group that comes together for social, religious, benevolent, literary, scientific, or political purposes. That is a piece of this definition. And it also specifies that they are not engaged in activities customarily carried on by a business or for pecuniary gain. So those are the two major prongs of that definition that are relevant here. the definition is somewhat specific, and it is limiting to a certain extent.
Paula,
It limits the type of activity. Yes, Jack?
I have Bill Buck on the phone and he's trying to get in on Zoom and it won't let him in. I don't know if there's anything that the town's doing or can do.
It says waiting.
Says waiting to him.
You might have the wrong link because it should be an auto. Everybody else was able to get in. Jack, can you give me his number? I can call him and try to sort this out. I'm just here.
I'll call you and try to sort it out. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Do you have his number, Jack?
Text.
Oh. 620-0282.
Okay. Public record.
There you go.
620.
Okay.
All right, I'll be back. Hopefully Bill will be back.
So we have a definition of community center club. In the broader context of the zoning scheme in the ordinance, a couple of points to be made about that there are, this proposal, the property on Millstream Road is located in the rural residential district. There are specific uses not allowed by the ordinance in the rural residential district. Those include a number of different activities, including indoor theater, restaurants, museums, libraries, offices, commercial recreation, and a term that is used, civic and convention center, which is also a defined term that includes public facilities for cultural, recreational, athletic, and entertainment purposes. So those are all things that are specifically prohibited in the rural residential district. Part of the discussion that has happened previously and some of the comment that was received during the comment period was about the fact that it isn't logical to prohibit those types of uses individually, but collectively under the umbrella of a community center or club to allow some of those various uses. Nor is it reasonable to prohibit those public activities, but not if they're being conducted privately. So that was a very broad description of some of the comment that was received around that particular point. And then finally on that, I think that, you'll all remember that we have had a fair amount of discussion about trying to pin down the actual uses that are being proposed and to come to a more complete understanding concerning the uses that would be conducted on the property. And that's been an area where we've not been particularly successful in getting the information to fill that void. The applicant has made the point that they are not certain which activities they want to conduct because the town is not specific in which activities it prohibits. So it's been a rather circular discussion in that respect. Finally, I would say that another point that has been raised and something that we've talked about before is that the majority of the information that we've heard and have about proposed uses, much of that has come from the property owner and from the perceptions of members of the public that have offered comment. And those comments have been around use of this property by the greater Readfield community, by the town in general, for a host of different activities, including, music, dance, art shows, craft shows, yoga classes, parties, weddings, concerts, very, very, very broad array of uses that have been put out there for discussion that in theory, this facility may look to engage in. So I think that that brings us to conversation around whether or not the community club as proposed is consistent with the vision of the ordinance as its defined community center club, and has looked to limit or allow various uses that might be participated in by such an entity. I had put together, and I wouldn't base the discussion on this list, but I had put together for all of you just a list of bullet points in which I attempted to capture all the public comments that were received. They're strictly bullets, more as reminders of the types of comments that we received during the comment period. And a number of those fall into this category about the definition, whether or not the proposal is consistent with the definition and with the broader zoning scheme put forward in the ordinance. So I would open it up for some conversation at this point around that particular issue.
So I have a few observations on this space, and it's really a bit of a catch-22. Paul, you referred to it as a circular argument. They're a new club, new members, and they have not been able to articulate all of the activities and uses that they're going to put or have or propose for this property. And it's clear in my mind that this property is not appropriately a catering hall or a place where you would have loud music every weekend. It's rural residential. There are neighbors, and they have property rights also. But I could see myself discussing limitations on the activities in that property that might make it acceptable to the overall community. But those limitations might be so dire or drastic that the safe space meeting house people might decide that it's not the appropriate venue for the activities they like to have. So we could maybe discuss some of those limitations. I read one of the public comments was the beautiful music that would be emanating from the building. Well, one man's beautiful music is another man's nuisance. So I would suggest maybe we think about putting, if we were to approve this, we put a limitation on amplified music, meaning bands and or DJs to maybe 2 or 3 times a year, something that you would see in a residential neighborhood where neighbors might get together and have a live band or a DJ for a party. That's kind of so, and there's lots of other restrictions I would suggest if we were to decide that this proposal made sense. But that's kind of the approach that I took when thinking about the use of this property. It's not ideal. The location is not ideal. So restrictions, I think, to make it fair for the residents that live in the neighborhood would have to be pretty significant.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Thoughts, anyone else?
I agree with Bill. I guess I would just, the thing I struggle with here is, I I don't have any problem with the concept of the applicant's desires overall. I think they're really good. You know, I think it's a great idea. I struggle with, you know, my job here is to apply it to the land use ordinance and how does it fit into the town's expectations. And that is not the same thing as a comment for or against this particular concept. And I hope the applicant understands that. I struggle with the activity and the lack of clarity from the applicant related to the types of activities. I would say in pretty much every application we get for whatever it is, there's a pretty clear, in fact, there's extremely clear understanding of what the activity is going to be. And that generally creates the architecture around the site review and this discussion of how it fits into the ordinance. Without the activity being defined or loosely defined, very loosely defined, which I can understand why that is. I can appreciate the fact that it is loosely defined from the applicant. But unfortunately, that creates a very challenging application of the ordinance. And for that reason, I would echo Bill and say that this is, for that reason, and looking at the land use table, I feel like it would have to be so heavily restricted that I think it would be it would come across as a very you know, sort of almost an unusable property for this purpose, basically.
Can I say something?
Could you hold your comment for the moment? I will come back to you, but I would like to use this immediate time to get comment from planning board members, and I will come back to you.
So Paula, could I go next?
Yes, please.
Hi. So I'd like to echo what Bill and Henry said as well. First of all, I appreciate all the work that the applicant has done here. And I think there are lots of hearts in right places. And I too support the general vision of community and, you know, people getting together and this whole concept of healing. I've struggled with the definition of community center and this idea of not being for activities that would customarily be done by a business or for pecuniary gain. Clearly, you don't have to make a profit to run afoul here of the definition. It's the word "or" I think is very instructive in this particular case. And I just don't think that conceptually the idea of this district and the vision behind the LUO for this district is compatible with the uses that are being proposed to the extent that we can even understand what uses are being proposed. The vagueness is very troubling for me, and this concept that we, you know, sort of, we can't tell you what we're going to do because you haven't told us what we can't do, just does not sit well with me. And that combined with the barrage of mailings from the owner telling us exactly what's going to happen, weddings, concerts, dances, those kinds of things, I just don't see that as being compatible.
Thank you, Jan.
Thanks.
If I
Yes,
may, sir.
yes, no.
I'm looking for a little clarification, maybe from the code officer or the applicant, potentially for comment later, but, you know, I'm looking at the definition of the community center club and in the conversation about what their intended use of the property is going to be. So my question, my thought process went to, what is the association that is seeking to have a clubhouse or whatever they might call it? What is the association? Does the Was that specified on the application?
Yeah, what they put forward was they did put forward information about this entity, which is established as a nonprofit called Safe Space Meeting House. And so that is in the application itself.
Thank you.
Others on this point?
Yeah, I can jump in next.
Okay, go ahead, Don.
So, first off, I don't disagree with what's been said prior. I think there are lots of concerns to hash through, but I wanted to actually go to a different question that's been brought up in the hearing and in the testimony, but I'm still struggling a bit with, which is the zoning issue. And the question about the resource protection.
Okay, we'll get there. That's on the list. I wanted to approach these in
Right.
order and begin with that broader issue of the table of uses and the proposed use and so forth. And so if there are any other comments around that issue, let's talk about those, and then we'll move on, because I think what Don is talking about is extremely important, and that is next on my list.
I had
Jack?
kind of related to this issue about the appropriateness of this entity in that area is the definition of the rural residential district, which is to accommodate low-density residential use, agriculture, and forestry operations, which are compatible with the preservation of Readfield's rural character. And so even though this is an allowed activity in the zone, it's allowed to the extent that it meets the district standards. And I have a hard time seeing from what's been described as what they want to do and the scope of what they want to do and the amount of parking and people that's consistent with the definition of that rural residential district. So that was my comment.
Personally, I'm in agreement with that comment. I keep coming back in my own mind to the fact that this is in fact a rural residential district. We had a number of comments from interested parties who made the point that Readfield citizens rely on and should be afforded the protections that the zoning scheme provides. And I absolutely agree with that. And one consideration for me is this is not the sole determining factor, but I'm personally very concerned about the impacts that this activity would have on particularly the Cody residents. That residence is in a rural residential district, and it would be almost completely surrounded by this community center club activity, parking, activities in the barn, and so forth. And I have a lot of difficulty on a personal level getting past that. I think people do have certain expectations about the protections that they will have as a result of zoning. And that's not a good example in my mind. Other comments about the general zoning scheme, the definition of community center club, and the matter of the activities being proposed.
So a point for discussion, I think, for the board would be the definition of a community center or club requires the activities or the facilities to be open only to members and guests. And some discussion of that might be helpful, because I know that one thing in my own mind I find difficult to wrap my head around is how would one, practically speaking, limit the use to members and guests? And what does membership look like? And how many guests are we talking about, essentially? So if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I can only answer it by saying I struggle with it as well. I know that's not helpful, but I also find there's a fine line in what I've heard from the applicant and read on the application between that and public access, even though it says members, guests, and friends, I believe is how it was worded. And I think that's fine, but there's a practical element there that I struggle with, which I think is, again, would have to be a restriction of approval if that occurred.
You know, in a number of places in the application, I recall discussion, actually one of those locations might be in the actual document that established the nonprofit. Some very general language about inviting in community, and there was something about the membership and so forth, but it left one with the impression that members and guests could certainly include the entire town of Readfield. I mean, that was kind of the direction that that piece took in its description.
If I recall correctly, I believe we had some conversation with the applicant on this issue vis-a-vis parking. And we were trying to sort of nail down how many cars they would expect at an event and what would happen if, you know, each applicant brought one friend. And I definitely struggle with the lack of clarity from the applicant with respect to how many people they anticipate. I don't believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that we ever really received clarity on the potential scope. And it may be because they don't have clarity at this point, but I struggle with that.
Was there clarity on the number of anticipated members?
So there was at one point of interested people, I believe. And I want to say that was over 50. Does
I
anyone?
think it was 150 people were interested.
150?
Right.
Yeah, and there were also some different numbers batted around in terms of parking as well. One number was 35, which was the initial number that they put forward that parking area on the other side of Millstream Road could accommodate. But in, you know, the very recent submission that was modified, and now that has changed to something closer to 75, if I recall correctly. And there had additionally been some conversation about the appropriateness of parking on Route 17 in addition. So the numbers have really been all over the place.
And this latest submission also includes 19 parking spots on the site, which I never saw how a site plan would accommodate 19 cars on the site. That's something new.
Well, I would just say sorry, go ahead,
No,
Paul.
go ahead, Henry. Go ahead.
I'm really trying to not make this stream of consciousness. I'm trying very hard to keep it focused on what you're asking. But in answer to that, I don't think any reasonable person would assume that 19 parking spaces in a rural residential neighborhood at a house is a reasonable, you know, that doesn't fly with the definition of a rural residential district. So.
And
Parking
as I
lot.
recall, Jack, is this correct? That 19 was right at the structure itself.
That's
Correct.
the way I understood it.
And then an additional block in the detached parking lot. So
Yeah.
Again, an issue that just has to be clarified and walked through.
Before we move on to another category, was it Leah? I'm not sure who had asked the question previously, or you had a comment and I said I'd come back to you.
Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
So I just wanted to visit a couple people have noted about the issue of sound coming from the barn. And I was curious if people have the information that has been submitted about the soundproofing that's been done there. There's been
Okay.
extensive soundproofing done and checked, and there's been more done. So the issue of sound going out into the community has been taken care of. The entire building has been soundproofed.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the issue of sound. I thought you had a comment on one of the issues that we were discussing previously. So we'll get around to talking about the noise and the sound issue as we move through this list.
Paula, sorry to interrupt. I think, one thing, since there's been a lack of clarity, one tactic I often find helpful is, without engaging in too much discussion, we're not trying to reopen the hearing here, but maybe questions to the applicant about whether they would commit to a certain cap on the number of members, whether they would commit to a certain cap on the number of attendees at events might help narrow things down a little bit.
Okay.
Want us to respond to that?
No, not yet, please. This is principally an opportunity for planning board members to deliberate on this. I agree, however, with Kristen that there may be questions in particular issues that we would like to raise with you. But the meeting tonight is not an extension of the public hearing, and it's not set up to be an ongoing conversation. It's principally for board members and their deliberations, but there may be some questions and comments that we would like to share with you. But we will go through this topic by topic, and for instance, we will come back to the issue of sound and noise. So if it makes sense to all of you, I think it would be appropriate to keep working through our list of topics. Make note of those where it might be appropriate if we head in that direction of talking about a set of limitations that we want to come back to and have some conversation with the applicant about that, as Kristen suggests. But unless you'd prefer to do it differently, I think I would like to run through the list of topics to begin with and have an initial conversation. And then we can come back to those where we think we need to discuss a bit further or seek some clarification or agreement from the applicant.
I like that. Paula.
Um,
I have a question about the process.
Who's speaking? Yes, Alex.
I just don't understand. Were we supposed to be here? Like, I just keep feeling like we should be responding, or should we just sort of listen and take our own notes, and then you'll let us know if you want us to say something?
Yeah, I mean, process wise, we certainly want to have you here, number one, and we're glad you are here. But as I mentioned earlier, this meeting is primarily for planning board members to have an opportunity to discuss and deliberate on everything we've we've read and heard and discussed previously. And so the focus is going to be on planning board discussions about these matters. We may have questions for you. There may be comments that are appropriate from you, but we'll let you know when we reach that point in our discussion. Don't feel like you need to respond to every issue that comes up, because that's not how this particular meeting is organized.
Okay.
So I think that takes us to the next broad issue, and this gets back to the matter that Don raised. There are two provisions in the ordinance that I draw your attention to at this point. The first one is the issue that Don mentioned specifically, and that is that a portion of the existing structure is in fact located in the resource protection zone because of its proximity to the stream, to Mill Stream itself. If you look in the ordinance and in the table of uses, community centers and clubs are prohibited uses in the resource protection zone. And so that takes us to a place where we have a portion of this building that is proposed for use as a community center club that is located in the resource protection zone. And that use is prohibited in the resource protection zone. So that is an issue that was raised in the comments, and an issue that did come up in some of our conversations earlier as well. A somewhat different but related issue that I would also put in front of you at this point is that Article 3, Section 4D is about changes of use of non-conforming structures. This structure is non-conforming because of its proximity to both the road and to the wetland, the edge of the wetland. And so there is a specific standard in the ordinance that pertains to a change of use of a non-conforming structure. And it provides that the use that's being proposed shall not have a greater adverse impact on the water body, tributary, stream, or wetland, or on the subject or adjacent properties and resources than the existing use. I view that provision as being directly relevant to this proposal and problematic for the proposal. The determination that the planning board have to make is that the use of the structure as a community center club would not have a greater adverse impact than a single family residence. So that's the bottom line nature of the question that we would have to respond to.
So I have a question of clarification. There's a barn and there's a house. Do both structures, are both structures in the resource protection zone, or just one of them?
A portion of the house is in the resource protection zone.
The entire building, though, is non-conforming structure.
Because they're attached.
Well, they're related issues, but they're separate. The fact that it's a non-conforming structure because it doesn't meet the minimum setback to the wetland or to the road, so it makes it a non-conforming structure. And then there is a separate issue of the resource protection zone and a portion of the house being located in the resource protection zone.
So my
Thank you.
understanding is that the application is not delineated to the barn. It's for ostensibly the whole building, correct? And I know that the lease is for the whole building.
Right.
So I think there could be a world in which, let's say the lease was just for the barn and the application was just for the barn, and the barn itself is out of the resource protection district, that could be approvable in that case. But if the evidence is that, it's the whole building that's subject to the use, subject to the lease, and a portion of that building falls within the RP zone, that would be a problem. And I guess one thing just for the record that we need to clarify, I wasn't involved in the prior meeting, so I just want to make sure that we're clear on what evidence we're referring to about, A, a portion of the building being an RP, and then B, whether it's a non-conforming structure.
So Kristen, you're going to where my head was going in terms of whether or not the house is or shouldn't be part of the lease agreement. I think it raises another question though also, and that would be the use of outside lands outside of the barn, which would then be in the resource protection zone for outside activities. So I see in my opening statement, I see another restriction on the use of the property here to protect the the resources protection zone. So two issues in my mind. One is the house seems by our ordinance clearly off limits to this activity. And then exterior activities around the barn would also create an issue in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because there were maps. I don't know which ones. I don't have them in front of me, but there were maps certainly that indicated like outdoor seating places and a lecture area, and it suggested outdoor activities that were part of the community center club.
Chairman, I have copies. Last public hearing we had here, I had copies of those maps on each of the three walls around me. I also brought copies tonight, which I could screen share with you if that becomes necessary. The two photographs I had is one is the E911 map that shows the distances of the barn and the house to the two areas you were alluding to. And the other one is the tax map that shows the zoning boundaries. So should it become necessary, I can screen share and share those with you as they are previously entered pieces of evidence.
And I think Paula has from the 2014, when we granted his application to expand the non-conforming structure, there was a site plan there that showed the locations of the house and the barn relative to the wetland and the road to show that it is non-conforming.
Yeah, I think they're delineated more clearly on that map than on the more recent maps. It showed very specifically what the 75-foot setback looked like from the wetland. And I believe the closest point of that building and what made it non-conforming with respect to the wetland was that it was 58 feet. And then the road was also indicated on that map. That's also a 75-foot setback. And I believe the setback to the road on that map was about 10 feet at the closest point.
Also, I think it's relevant that back in 2014, the owner conceded that it was a non-conforming structure and applied for that expansion, right?
Yeah. And there was discussion about the fact that it was a non-conforming structure in the approval for that barn, because initially, as I recall, the barn was going to be larger, and we had this conversation about setbacks, and the configuration was modified as a result of that. So there is a fair amount of discussion in that earlier decision. So I didn't have a chance to talk to you about this piece, Kristen, but I'll just put it on the table because I think in looking at it, I think it is also relevant. It wouldn't be the, the deciding factor necessarily, but I think that there is another piece in the non-conforming article that may be pertinent here, and that is in section 5 of Article 3 that discusses non-conforming uses. And there is, so what we were just talking about a minute ago was a change of use of a non-conforming structure. And there is a standard that applies to that. No greater adverse impact, and there's some additional language. In section 5D, it talks about an existing non-conforming use may be changed to another non-conforming use, provided that the proposed use, again, has no greater adverse impact on the subject and adjacent properties. And there's a lot of specific language that is a bit different in the change of use piece than in the change of use of a non-conforming structure piece. And as I looked at it, it seemed to me that they both apply.
But what is the existing non-conforming use?
If you look at the table of uses, and this is where my question to you is, and the existing table of uses, if you look at single family dwelling, in the resource protection zone, I mean, obviously this was existing. It was a single family dwelling for a long time. It never went through any sort of approval process. So single family dwellings, in order to be approved in the resource protection zone, that superscript number 5 indicates that single family dwellings may be allowed by special exception only, according to the provisions of a separate article. And so that led me to believe that, I mean, this is an existing non-conforming use because it was never actually approved. Nor could it be approved in all likelihood if you look at the provisions that are cited in that superscript.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, this single family, multifamily dwelling, it's always been a little bit of a point of contention to me. These terms and the way they're used in the land use table here really derive from shoreland zoning, and they kind of mix the concepts of structure and use a little bit.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And so the dwelling itself is what has to be permitted in a special exception permit review. Nobody's really looking at the use in terms of, you know, what type of use is going on inside of the building.
Well, except, yeah. I mean, that really is the focus of our discussion for most of this table. It's the use itself. And that is the way this table is routinely used.
No, I agree. And it's relatively, I mean, it's certainly a subsidiary issue because the primary issue is the use that's being proposed in the RP district. Is that allowed under the table? And, you know, the primary issue here is that the community center or club would not be allowed in RP. So it's almost irrelevant whether you can change from a non-conforming residential use to this other use, because that other, the proposed use isn't allowed in and of itself in RP. So I think it's maybe questionable whether it's currently a non-conforming use. It's certainly, you know, maybe that's another reason why we would call it a non-conforming structure, in the sense that as a single family dwelling, which is what that building is, it's not allowed in RP because it doesn't have special exception approval.
Right, right.
And that's what makes it non-conforming. So whichever way you look at it, yeah.
Mhm. Okay. But it doesn't seem to me that there is much question about the fact that it is a non-conforming structure, and its change of use would require that the planning board make that finding about no greater adverse impact.
I agree. And there hasn't been a lot of discussion, at least in this round yet, about whether you feel it would be a greater adverse impact.
Now, we haven't talked about the particulars.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, I mean, what I'm doing right now is taking copious notes of all the issues that are raised. And this is going to inform what I would write in findings. So, you know, get it all out there now, I think. And then the idea would be to go back and we'll go through the approval standards and through these issues and see whether you feel it's a basis for approval or denial.
The only thing that I would add there is that the goal with non-conforming structures is to, over time, eliminate their use and not expand them or expand their uses to be more intensive than they are now. This would clearly be more intensive use of that land area with, you know, 19 parking spots on site and all outdoor activities, and which would be close to the wetlands there and the stream. So it's an expansion of the use.
And it also talks specifically in that provision about adverse impacts on the subject or adjacent properties and resources. And a good part of the conversation around this has been about potential impacts on adjacent properties.
Yep,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
I just had another comment, because I don't think you mentioned it, but I think it's just sort of layers it on top, which is a complication, which is if there's a lot is split by a land use line,
Right.
then the requirements of the ordinance for that particular district apply only to that part of the lot in which lie in that district. So that just further complicates. I mean, you're saying the same thing, but I just wanted to say that is specifically called out in the ordinance. So that creates a complication related to the structure.
And I think at that point, you need to take into consideration the, you know, it would be one thing if what we were talking about was the split lot, and you had the opportunity to choose what you're going to build on certain portions of the lot. That's a cleaner situation than the one we have in front of us, where we have an existing non-conforming structure, a portion of which is located in the RP zone. And I think it takes us to a place where we need to think about the feasibility, of requiring that this activity not take place within that portion of a structure. Is that even practical? I mean, you can't put tape on the
Yep.
floor and tell people not to go beyond it. So I think it's another consideration. Are we going to look at it as a whole, or start talking about trying to restrict movement in the building that's going to be used for that purpose to avoid that portion? And that doesn't address the good point that Bill raised about the outdoor activities as well. I mean, those have been proposed at various points in the application. And so I think we need to consider, both indoor and outdoor to
Yeah.
some extent.
In being fair to, in being consistent in the way so to me, the non-conformance issue is a real problem for me. And I think that if we're consistent with how we've applied that in all cases, I would say, I would echo Jack in saying that, the objective is to make things less non-conforming. And secondly, the adverse impact on subject and adjacent properties, that statement alone, I don't see how it can meet that test. To me, that's a key problem in the ordinance.
Other comments, observations about, either of those, the non-conforming structure piece or the location in the RP zone?
Well, Madam Chairman, I heard
Yes.
you read section, Article 3, Section 1, which is a very tight line about what non-conformance and where to go is. It's 5 lines and it's important in all land use. So I ask you maybe to read that.
Where are you reading again, Chip?
I can read it for you if you'd like. It's article of our LUO Article 3, titled Non-Conformance, Section 1, which is the overall call.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. So you're talking about the purpose of this article? Is that where you're reading?
Yes.
Okay. So what Chip is pointing out is Section 1, the purpose in the nonconformance article, that states the purpose of this article is to promote land uses which conform to the terms of the town's ordinances, except that legally created non-conforming conditions which existed before the effective date of this ordinance shall be allowed to continue subject to the requirements of this article. A non-conforming condition shall not be permitted to become more non-conforming.
And to that last point, Paula, I do recall that when the planning board deliberated on the barn, we did have discussions about whether it was going to be more non-conforming, but again, because the applicant was insistent that it was a single family home only.
Correct.
And that the barn was not going to extend further into that zone. We were able to make that finding that it was not more non-conforming.
Right. Yeah,
But
I have that.
only as a single family use.
And it was because of that, identification as single family residential. That was the approved use at the time. That was the context within which the barn was approved. Jan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone said. It'll be very boring, but I was also looking at the aerial map that I believe Chip gave us a few meetings ago. But am I correct that it's sort of the front strip of the lot that's in resource protection that is parallel to Millstream Road? Because it appears that at least from the aerial map, that you couldn't really even meaningfully access the property, whether it be the structure or just the land itself, without going across the resource protection zone, which is a problem as well. If there's any sort of effort to, parse out a portion of the structure that wouldn't be used, I still think it's problematic just from an access perspective.
I did not find that map to be particularly helpful, and I'm going back to the original application. It was actually the back of the house. It was the setback to the wetland, not on the front. It almost looked to me on that map like it was offset somewhat. I didn't know if others had that same perception, but it did raise some questions in my mind.
Yeah, are you looking at it right now, that green swath of resource protection on the aerial map? Is that inaccurate? I'm sorry, on the zone map rather. The aerial map's just a photo.
I have the photo and I can screen share it for you at this point.
I would find it helpful, yeah.
Yeah, please do
Yeah,
that.
that'd be great. Thank you.
Now, so
I'll change the.
Eric's going to change the, but if we do the map, you're both right. You know, the front part of it towards Main Street, there is that dark green resource protection area. In the back, you've got the wetland protection area. And the building intrudes on 75 foot, you know, on the back and directly touches on the front.
And this map we're looking at doesn't match the paper version of the resource protection zone that we have on the zoning maps. The printed.
This is from the zoning maps.
I'm sorry?
That is directly from the zoning maps. This is an aerial view.
Well, I'm looking at the zoning map and I'm telling you, it's not the same. So they're not the same. They're offset slightly. I think it's just a digitization issue, but basically the resource protection zone goes from the basically along the entire lower part of the property, from corner to corner, essentially. So it's up, basically you take that little green line and move it up a little bit into the yellow there. So the whole front edge of the property, Jan, is in resource protections and including clipping the front of bottom corner of the building.
And there's an incursion into the structure.
Yeah.
Of the resource protection zone.
Yeah.
And that's how you would access the property from that off Millstream Road. Oops.
Well, I think that is part of the proposal, and the new document that we got with the additional parking spaces that Jack was referencing earlier. That would be the way you would access that.
So the second map gives you some direction in terms of where the structures are currently positioned, with some measurements showing you from the road and from the protected area in the back.
Yep.
Okay.
Can you show the printed land use map just for comparison, or is that necessary? Probably not.
Well, I think this may be something that we're going to need to pin down a little more clearly and specifically. And
Agreed.
Chip, I do think it's easier to follow on the map that was put together for the 2014 permit. In fact, the CEO, Cliff at the time, had done the measurements, and they were placed on the map according to the measurements that he had done. It's got the stream protection setbacks, the road setback, and I believe the wetland as well. Anything further right now on either of those issues? The other three, I guess among the most significant issues that we've discussed and heard about, these three relate to other provisions in the ordinance, including the site review criteria. And the ones I had made particular note of are noise, traffic, and parking. There are some other issues as well, but those three, I think, really rise to the top in terms of significance in the discussions that we've had and the comments that we've heard.
Paula, does that
Yeah.
does that include the town statement about the need to reconstruct the road and the fire chief's thing about putting in a walkway 10 feet off the road?
Yeah, I mean, we can begin with that, with that issue. I guess I was putting that somewhat into the traffic category
Okay.
in the site review standards.
Okay.
If you want to begin with that issue, we can talk about that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I think that issue goes to the issue of undue financial burden on the township. That road is, I live on a dirt road, and I know what it takes and costs us to maintain that dirt road, especially in the springtime when Readfield roads are posted, and our road pretty much gets trashed every year, and there's only 6 people living on this road. So I do think this takes me back to a restriction. I don't think this road is adequate for the purposes, for the kind of traffic that they're suggesting is going to be on here. And if it were adequate, it would get destroyed when roads are posted in Readfield and have to be rebuilt every year.
I think we heard that from Eric Dyer too, I think.
Yeah, that would cost the taxpayers some money. So that takes me to another restriction, which I let off with, which would be this property would not, in my view, this property shouldn't be accessed when roads are posted in the late winter, early spring, because the road would just get trashed and Readfield would have to rebuild it.
And so that group of issues around traffic is number 17 of the site review standards, which is on page 18 of the ordinance. And the standard itself is that the proposed activity shall not cause highway or road congestion or unsafe conditions with respect to the use of the highways or roads existing or proposed.
So there, the fire chief said that you'd have to have a walkway 10 feet off that road because that road was so bad and not wide enough for emergency vehicles. So pedestrians would have to walk on a walkway 10 feet off the roadway. I don't know where that would be. I guess it would be between Mill Stream and 17 somewhere. I don't know who owns that.
So there's a portion, as I recall from the map, there's the parking area that is owned by, I think it was transferred, if I remember correctly, to Mr. Batara's son. And then there's a piece of property in the middle that is owned by the Codys. And then the piece on the end directly adjacent to the barn and the house is again in the same ownership as the barn, the house, and the parking lot. So it is split up there. So if there was going to be a 10-foot walkway along the whole length, I think they would be crossing onto the Cody's property.
I think it was 10 feet off the roadway. Not a 10-foot walkway. I think it was 10 feet off the roadway. There'd have to be a walkway, a pedestrian walkway. So again, getting to Bill's point, I don't know whether that would be a cost borne by the town or by the applicant. That was a life safety, fire safety issue.
So there's the issue of the roadway, but there's the matter of the road itself and the condition of the road, which would be borne by the town. Jack, you had mentioned the most recent proposal that was submitted concerning parking. It's not something that we had spent any time reviewing as a board because it was just submitted. I mean, it was very recent. And, you know, I quite honestly was having some difficulty reading it. It's small, difficult to read. I don't know, Chip, do you have a full-size plan of that in the town office?
You're looking for what now?
This is the most recent parking proposal with the 73 parking spaces and the revised. Okay, so is that a full-size plan?
No, this is just what came on the 8.5 by 11. I can't really read it and I don't know how
Yeah.
it's big.
Yeah, I was having some trouble reading it.
It was only electronic submission. That's how we got it. That's what we
All
have.
right. Okay. And if I remember correctly, that version calls for a total of, is it 73 parking spaces, Jack?
Well, that's 54 parking spaces in the lot and then 19 additional spots on 26 Millstream Road property. For a total
And
of
Chip,
73.
as you looked at that proposal, one of the things that we had talked about previously was that any parking plan would need to be engineered to ensure conformance with the performance standards in the ordinance. Was that plan, was it signed and stamped? Do we know if it's in conformance with the performance standards?
We took a look at it, Cliff and I, and it didn't really lay out the size of the parking spaces or the number of proposed handicap spaces that were necessary for crowds that, again, we don't have a definitive number on. So we do have standards on the sizes of, you know, regular spaces, and that wasn't provided in the plan that was given.
So we do or do not know that it conforms to the performance standard?
Do not.
Does not?
Does not.
Okay, all right. And there is, although we have the general traffic standard in the site review standards, there is a, in Article 8 of the ordinance, which is performance requirements and standards, Section 17 talks about parking areas, and that's where the general standard appears. And it's pretty general, but it does talk about the size of typical parking spaces and travel aisles. And it also provides that parking areas subject to site review, which this is, shall meet the setback requirements to the greatest extent practical, for structures in the district in which such areas are located. So I don't know, if there was any look at setback requirements with regard to the parking area either. So I guess that's all that can be said about the parking proposal, unless you have anything else.
I know that we asked for it 3 or 4 times. And so
Yeah.
this is the latest, but it still, as you point out, doesn't show the measurements, how they're coming up with this number of spots, or whether they need setbacks or anything.
What about adequacy for the proposed use? I think a starting point there would normally be, how many people is this use intended to serve? And we don't have that starting point so well here, but an interesting discussion point might be, can you go backwards from the number of spaces they're offering to suggest what the reasonable capacity might be? We don't, like a lot of towns would have standards that say for an event center, you would need 1 parking spot for every 2 or 3 attendees. We don't have that. But it might be interesting to kind of ballpark from what they're proposing to provide, what the size of the use might be.
Well, they also propose parking along the road, though. So it's more than that.
Yeah.
And the board hasn't really touched on that, right? In terms of the safety of that.
Well, there's been general discussion about it because there was some dispute about whether or not DOT had taken a position on that issue. DOT said that they did not, and that it was up to the town to determine whether or not we wanted to allow parking on the road. There were some general concerns expressed about safety, on that stretch of road. If people were parking there, it suggests that pedestrians will be walking on 17. And so there were a number of concerns that were expressed around that. Anyone else? You have any other recollections about that conversation?
I know it was suggested by somebody, I think somebody on the select board, that parking could be along 17 up, could be on 17, just like it is for Readfield Heritage Days. But I think that stretch of 17 by Millstream Road, I think the speed limit there is 50, not 25.
Yeah.
So, and also she proposed parking in the town hall parking lot, I think, or running a shuttle to Maranacook.
Yeah.
But the applicant hasn't proposed any of that.
And I think Kristen was getting at this. This really goes to the question of how many people will this structure hold? What would be a reasonable occupancy limit for it? And I heard numbers like 200 mentioned at one point in time, and this building is not that big. When you start bringing, numbers of people like that in, you're bringing in a huge amount of traffic congestion. When we did the site view, I pulled out of there on my truck onto 17, and it's, traffic is coming up and downhill. There's a slight curve there, and it's not an easy place to get out of. So there, in my view, there's no way we want people parking on 17. It's no way we want people walking on 17. It's just dangerous.
Now, in terms of numbers of people, I think we're back in the same position that we've been in several times when we've talked about this issue, that it's very unclear. We don't know what the activities are that would draw people. we were looking at the numbers of parking spaces. That was the one quantifiable piece of information that we had. And that's changed significantly. Initially, there was discussion around 35, and now we're up to 73 on the property itself, with a proposal to also park on the road. And so it's impossible to really pin that down for a better understanding about the numbers of people that were anticipated.
Well, I mean, this most accurate, or this most recent submission probably is what the board needs to rely on in terms of what type of numbers they're talking about. And so again, we don't have a standard that says, 2 people per vehicle or anything like that, but I think you could extrapolate from the 73 spots plus extra parking that they were presuming that, by my math, that's around 150 to 200 plus people.
And again, I would just, if we're looking at that, I would just say the graphic we've received is sort of illegible. I can't really read it. And then there's clearly parking in the resource protection area and the wetland there. So that's what, I can see that much. So just those 2 points alone, obviously would require more restriction and discussion.
Okay, anything further on traffic and parking? Or have we covered all the points around that?
You may have just said this, but we've been talking about a lot. Can you just remind me what the fire chief said about emergency vehicle access? Was there any? I can't, because I know that's happened a couple of times. I just can't remember what the conclusion was.
I think he said that it was a road that is just like a little carriageway, that it was insufficient for really emergency vehicles. And that's why he recommended the walkway 10 feet off the road surface, because emergency vehicles, he said, would have a hard time navigating that road and seeing pedestrians.
Okay.
What I don't recall is if he addressed, the issue of, turnaround at the end and that sort of thing. His comment about a pedestrian walkway seems to make the assumption that an emergency vehicle could make its way down that road, but unless there was danger of hitting people and endangering pedestrians, the walkway was needed. But that suggests to me that the road itself may not be, adequate for emergency vehicle use. But I don't recall that he addressed that specifically, or if he just made the assumption that emergency vehicles would access it and will have to take care of pedestrians because of the state of that road.
Well, I think it would be accessible in the sense there is another residence on that road, but as a single,
Yeah.
property. But I think in the situation where you have, pick your number of occupancy and number of other vehicles, I think, that's a valid concern, a very valid concern. It's sort of at a dead end, not a dead end, but there's that turnaround there. But you can't.
Yeah,
right
you can't go very far with that.
You got a fire truck there. I don't know quite how you would manage it with a bunch of cars there.
Yeah. Okay. The last on my list of major issues is the matter of.
Paula?
Yes, Jack.
There is an email from Lee Bank to Eric on July 27th that we have in the file. But he said that, as you know, Mill Stream is nothing more than a old wagon road with some gravel on it. It does not meet the town's current road standards for the safety concerns in the event of fire or medical emergency. I must ask that there is absolutely no parking along the road. If there is a remote parking area, I also ask that a path or sidewalk be constructed for pedestrian traffic, be located at least 10 feet away from the Mill Stream Road. Ambulances and fire apparatus are very wide and often limited by visibility. So
Okay.
no parking along the road.
Well, thanks for that, Jack.
That was in an email from the CEO on July 30th.
Very. Okay, the last of the major issues on my list, and not that there aren't other issues to be discussed, but noise came up on multiple occasions as being a significant issue, and it is something that we've talked about previously as well. This is another one of the standards that is linked to a certain extent with the proposed activities. And because we're not fully equipped to have that conversation, it's difficult to talk about noise when we don't know what the possible sources of the noise would be. I mean, music, certainly, that's something that's featured, I think, in all the lists of possible proposed uses. And initially, there had been discussion about some limited degree of soundproofing that had been done in the building. And we just heard the applicant a short time ago talk about additional work that's been completed recently. And we don't know much of anything about that at this point. You know, what the extent of the work was, whether or not it's adequate. And I don't know, you know, how deep we can get into that this evening to explore all the detail of that. But it sounds as though some additional work has been done, and they may be proposing more potentially in terms of soundproofing the building.
There's,
Jack?
Go on. No, you can go
on. I was going to ask if, you know, if you'd like to hear from the applicant about just generally where that stands at this point, if this would be useful, if that would be useful, or.
Well, I wanted to mention, we talked also about noise from people parking their cars and then walking down Mill Street Road. We also talked about noise from people being these outdoor activity areas, creating noise. And also in terms of the noise emanating from the building, we asked whether they would keep the doors and windows closed. And I think they said yes. And in terms of people walking down the road, I don't know what they intended to do to control that. I mean, all these things are problematic in terms of enforcement. You know, they just don't make sense to say to people, you can sit outside, but you can't make noise, or you can walk down the road, but you can't talk. Or it's summer and it's 90 inside here, but we can't open the windows.
Yeah, so there are definitely a number of sources potentially.
And also some of the abutters testified that they, on the events that have been held there, that they have heard lots of noise, or when people were working on the building, they heard the sound travels up the Mill Stream to other abutters.
So just
Jan, go ahead.
Sorry, Paula. Just echoing what Jack said, I appreciate the efforts at soundproofing, and we may hear more about it, but I'm in complete agreement that it doesn't mitigate the problem entirely when you have windows and doors and summer concerts and 70+ parking spaces. You know, just the sheer volume of people that could be coming to these events alone, and the noise that they would make just getting to and from the barn and their cars is a concern. And it's just unrealistic to think that that number of people, or even a much smaller number of people, are going to attend musical events and aren't going to, pour out to congregate outside the doors. And that's
Would it be helpful to board members to hear from the applicant about the soundproofing measures or not? Not, apparently.
Yeah, I'm struggling to, I don't think so, because it's, that's only assuming the use is completely inside, which is not what the application is for.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's sort of a moot point, or a mute point.
I agree.
A mute point. Okay. Okay, are there any other issues that we haven't talked about that, that any of you put in that particularly important category, things that we should call out specifically and have a conversation around? In looking at the list of criteria, the site review criteria, those are the ones that that stood out in my mind, but there may be others that you've identified. If there are, this would be a good time to touch on those.
So there was one other thing that, and I'm not sure the facts around this. In our site review, we didn't go in the building, but it did look to me like there were commercial cooking facilities in the building, just from the venting that I saw coming out of the building.
Yes.
And I think, it is not an appropriate location for commercial cooking. That does, you pass a restaurant and you see noxious, smells like hamburgers 3 blocks away. And I think that would be an issue. No problems with catering on the property and refrigeration, but commercial cooking, I think is I wouldn't want that next door to me if I if people live next door. So
Yeah, I agree with that, Bill. And I'd also like to point out that it's not consistent with the definition of community center or club, as commercial cooking is customarily a business activity.
yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with them catering food in and refrigeration and all of that, but there's commercial cooking facilities on site. The temptation to use them would be very difficult to overcome.
Okay.
And one other point would be lighting issues. It's a dark country road, and you've got people walking through there at night. I think there are some lighting safety concerns that should at least be mentioned. I don't know what to do about them, but those are.
There is a specific performance standard in the ordinance around lighting, and I think that that would certainly be triggered. And I do recall somewhere in the application there had been some general reference to outside lighting, because the facility connects to the town trails, and there had been some discussion about lighting of some of those areas. So
I guess
I agree.
my concern goes more towards getting from the facility to the parking areas in complete darkness. So it's just a safety issue. and how do you address that?
Okay,
I
so you're
think-
talking about it as a safety issue and not an impact issue.
Yeah, I think we did see something about impact in my deep recesses of my memory, and it was discussed that the lighting would be pointed down. There are code restrictions on lighting and
Yes,
halo.
yeah.
So I'll assume that around the building they'll address all of those issues. But my issue is more of a safety one. When if you're going to have 73 cars moving about that area and pedestrians, and I know how dark it can be we all know how dark it can be on a country road. So.
Okay.
You know, I just bring up another comment, which is something to consider, which is what I consider some significant inconsistency in the articles of incorporation and bylaws of the organization versus the application that's been submitted and some of the discussion that we've been having. And we can go into that in more detail at some point if necessary. But, you know, for example, suggesting that the town, you know, seeking money from the town for maintenance of the structure, similar to other structures in town, even though those other structures are, you know, it's a different scenario. So I think there's some financial support. I would say there, you know, meaning there's financial burden that's taken on by the town in such a scenario. So also just things related to its use. We've been struggling to find out what the use is, but in those things, it's very clear that some of the uses, not all of them, are consistent, I think, with what we've heard, but includes cooking and music and things like that. So I do think that even though we're struggling to maybe find these things, there's that information is existing to some degree in the information they filed with the state and also in their bylaws. But there is inconsistencies in here, which if we ever get to that point, I think those would have to be resolved. Or at least aligned with the town's restrictions and or thought process. So just another category of concern that I have is that what's written isn't necessarily what they're saying.
Okay, I think it might be appropriate at this point to run down through the list of review criteria and make at least an initial decision on whether or not we believe the applicant has met each individual criterion. And as I mentioned before, you know, we will have opportunity to come back to these, discuss them again, revise them if need be. But I think it would be useful to go through that exercise now as an initial matter and see where we stand. So the site review criteria begin on page 16 of the ordinance. The first being aesthetic, cultural, and natural values. The proposed activity shall not have an undue adverse effect on the scenic or natural beauty of the area, aesthetics, historic sites, archaeological sites, significant wildlife habitat, identified or defined by the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife or the town of Readfield, or rare plant and animal species, critical habitats, significant or irreplaceable natural areas or resources identified by the Department of Conservation, or any public rights for physical or visual access to the shoreline. So I don't think that we've identified anything that would run afoul of that standard, unless I'm not thinking of something that comes to your mind. So please speak up. Okay. So if there is nothing, if there's general agreement that the standard has been met and it will not be an undue adverse effect on any of those resources, we can take a vote on this first criterion.
I guess, sorry, Paul, I don't mean to, I just have a question. I guess in some of the material that I've received related to this application, and also just in some of the public comments, I believe this is a big one, it refers to the historic factory square and other cultural type aspects of that, but I'm not sure any of that meets this criteria. I'm a little confused, like what that means.
I recall a comment that came in about Factory Square, and there apparently, I think it was within the context of the comprehensive plan, actually, that there had been some thought about having Factory Square designated as in some fashion as a historic site. And the concern that was raised was that additional development of 26 Mill Stream or additional activities might in some way impact that effort and be a detriment to that designation.
Yeah, the question that exactly, it says, I won't read the whole thing, but basically questions about the historical preservation or designation and status of the Factory Square area. That's what it was related to. But I didn't know if it actually was. I guess the question is that area designated in some formal way already by the state or the town?
I don't think it is, and I think that was the origin of the comment, that there is thought behind pursuing that.
Got it.
And the concern was that this activity at this site might cause that to be, impossible.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
So is there a motion on this standard?
I'll move that the applicant meets this standard.
Second.
Second.
We have a second discussion. Okay. So it's been moved and seconded that this standard has been met. And Jack and I had talked about this a little bit before the meeting. I think what we would like to propose is that we go through, make our determinations, make the motions, and then come back and vote on those standards in a block, so that we're not doing roll call votes on 25 different standards. This first one is it's been moved and seconded that that the standard has been met. And as we go through, we can list those and then come back and vote as a block if that works for everyone. I mean, if there are any objections, we should talk about those when the motion is made, so that we have indication of that. But if we're in agreement, if we could vote on them as a block, it would be a time saver. If that makes sense to everyone.
Makes sense to me.
Yes.
Yep, works for me.
Okay. All right. Number two, conformity with local ordinances and plans. The proposed activities shall conform with all applicable ordinances and the comprehensive plan.
I don't know what they mean by that.
Yeah,
Things other than the land use ordinance?
And that includes this ordinance too. So I think this is your catch-all where issues of the non-conforming use change and the allowance of the use in the RP district would come into play as well.
Okay. And I would say they don't meet this standard.
Second.
Was that a motion?
Oh, do I have, oh,
Well,
make a mo-
it,
okay. So I'll make a motion that they don't meet this standard.
and Jan seconds, discussion. I would, I think I would, I would also put out there that, you know, I have some significant concerns around the broader zoning scheme and whether or not the proposed activity is consistent with the zoning scheme and the definitions. And that is something that has its foundation in the comp plan. And I think there's an argument to be made that it is not consistent with the comp plan for that reason.
Yeah, and I have a tough time with any standard like this, and maybe make a mental note to address this in the future, but the comprehensive plan is supposed to be kind of sucked into and form the basis of this zoning ordinance, this land use ordinance. And so we don't want to get into the specifics of the comp plan, but what we can talk about is, what does the zone allow? Is it the type of use that the zone allows? And to the extent there's ambiguity between the different types of uses that might apply here and where this thing falls, you know, what are the purposes of this district and how does that all relate to each other?
And that gets back to the conversation that we had at the beginning of the meeting.
Correct.
Yeah.
Erosion.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second on number 2. Is there any further discussion about number 2? The motion is that the proposal does not meet number 2. Okay. Number 3, erosion.
I'd say they meet it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no construction proposed, strictly a change in activity. Anyone
Right.
else have thoughts on that?
I'll make a motion that they meet it.
Okay,
I'll second it then.
Don seconds, discussion. Okay. Number 4, financial burden on the town.
I'll make a motion that they don't meet it. Because of the road. Mostly because of the road, I guess.
Second,
I second it, yeah, Jan does. Beat me to it.
Okay. Discussion?
I'd say because of the road, but also because of the revenue stream that's indicated or requested in the bylaws, which is specifically implying seeking town money for maintenance and or revenue stream, quote, revenue stream will be required to support the town generated public use of safe space meeting out lands and facilities, unquote.
Okay, further discussion?
Well, one other thing is that the sidewalk or walkway, whatever the fire chief recommended, would be another issue.
So your assumption was that he was suggesting that that would be a town?
Well, he
Bill?
just said it would be needed. I don't know who would build it.
It was unclear who was going to build it. Yeah.
Right.
But the applicant doesn't own all the property that would be needed or have rights to the property that would be needed to do so. So I think the burden would, to the extent it's needed for public safety, fall on the town.
Fall to the town.
Yeah.
Okay.
Henry, I'm sorry, could you clarify a little bit, since I'll have to write this up? They're saying that the town would be expected to contribute to what?
I can just send it to you. It's just in their bylaws, which was in the attached to the application. There's a section in the bylaws that talks about revenue stream. and how the organization would be funded. And in that section, it discusses a comparison to the Union Meeting House in Readfield, which it says they will follow an example. And when they say the example, I believe they mean the revenue example through donations, I'm assuming, for funding the work. But they also then discuss the connectivity to the town through an easement and a trail system, which is town, now it's a town easement, and therefore the town would be, it looks like talking about public town use of their land. Revenue stream will be, it's even underlined, revenue stream will be required to support the town generated public use of safe space meeting house land and facilities. So it's just a little unclear to me, what they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I see that maybe more as a vision statement or a business plan than it is something where they're foisting responsibility on the town. So I might distinguish that a little bit from,
Sure.
The town having to repair a road, the town's having to put in a sidewalk.
I would agree. I could interpret it that way as well. I think I would just encourage you to read that paragraph, or we can talk about it here, but it's not necessary. Just read the paragraph and see. It's a little confusing to me, but it clearly talks about public funds.
Thanks.
Okay, number 5, financial and technical capacity. So this is the financial and technical capacity of the applicant to carry through on their proposal. I think they had made a statement that they had financial and technical capacity to conduct it.
Well, my concern is that I've raised is the capacity to monitor or enforce all the things that they would need to enforce in terms of members and guests only, numbers of people attending, parking, noise, keeping windows closed, all those things. And it says that they have to meet the criteria of all applicable ordinances, which is to control noise and odor and parking, all that stuff. I don't know an organization of 2 people or 4 people, and I just haven't heard a realistic plan for how to mitigate all these adverse impacts. So I don't know if that fits there.
Kristen, what do you think about that one?
To construct and maintain the proposed improvements and meet the criteria of all applicable ordinances. So I think that technical capacity to ensure, ongoing compliance with the ordinances or any conditions that you might put on is significant and relevant to that. And then I think the other thing is, to the extent they're proposing improvements to the parking in both spots, do we know what the cost of that is and whether they have the financing to build those out? I'm not sure. I don't recall any other physical improvements that they're suggesting they're going to make, but
Right.
the cost of those would be relevant.
And so maybe this is one of those criteria, one of those situations where our response ultimately will be that we have insufficient evidence to make a positive conclusion about this particular criterion.
They've not submitted anything like a bank statement or letter of credit or proof of financing or anything like that, right? Just a statement saying that we're able to do this.
Yeah, I don't recall any financial documents that were submitted.
Nor do we know what these improvements are going to cost,
Right.
or the ultimate design of them. So we don't have enough information to have a motion on this one at all, other than to say we don't know.
Well, we did have some information at one point about a checking account balance or something like that. way back in the beginning, but nothing about a letter of credit. Does anyone else remember that? There was some sort of bank statement.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was like $3,000 or something in the account.
But nowhere did the, I mean, the parking lot issue, that seems to be the, the only, real on the ground improvement that they're talking about making. And I don't think there was anything financial that accompanied that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. The only other statement I found was a statement in the application that just says, we have adequate financial resources to use and maintain this property. That was it.
So Kristen, I'm thinking that it's appropriate to, we could move that the standard isn't met based on the insufficiency of the evidence to allow us to make a conclusion.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. I think given that it's applicant's burden of proof, that it would be, they've failed to submit evidence sufficient of both the cost of the projected improvements and their ability to demonstrate the ability to meet that cost.
So based on that, is there a motion?
Make a motion that they don't meet that criteria.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Further discussion about that? Okay. Number 6 is flood areas. Activity shall not adversely affect floodplain areas as depicted on the Federal Emergency Management Agency's flood insurance rate maps, etc. I don't remember if that was identified. Chip, do you?
The applicant says the property is not located within any flood areas, but I don't know if we ever checked that.
Yeah. And Chip, do you know?
Don't remember seeing anything about flood area, no.
Well, I suppose, the way to look at it would be that the only portion of the activity that is proposed to be conducted on that site is the construction of the parking lot. I mean, the music venues and so forth have nothing to do with the floodplain maps. So it might be limited to the parking area, which even if land near the stream was in the flood zone, that parking area is likely not, but I don't know that to be a fact.
We're not on any FEMA flood zone map.
It isn't, okay. Yeah, that's the question. Okay. Okay, so is there a motion on number 6?
I'll make a motion that they meet number 6.
A second?
Second it.
Okay. Number 7, wetlands. Proposed activity shall not have an adverse impact on wetlands.
I don't know about this one because I think Eric raised this issue and somebody else did about the impact on the wetlands of having all these people traipsing around.
So
Okay.
the proximity to the wetland and the increased activity on site in general. Is that what you're talking about?
Right.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little ambivalent about this one. I think
Yeah,
potentially it could happen, but I'm not feeling a direct connection
Okay.
to any particular part of their proposal.
I think this is
Others?
a question about the zoning and the resource protection. And is the resource protection area because of the wetlands? And, you know, if you're increasing the nonconformity based on use, then an argument can be made there that there could be impacts.
I think for this one, I'm more concerned about specific impacts on the wetland versus, I think what you're pointing out, Don, is really more about the violation related to being in the RP zone itself.
Right.
And that probably covers the issue. For wetlands, I think we'd really be talking about, you know, is there a reason to believe with some degree of certainty that there's going to be runoff into the wetlands or some sort of erosion or
Alteration.
like that.
Yeah, I don't see that.
Okay. Others? Is there a motion on this one?
I'll make a motion that they meet the wetlands requirement.
Second? Anyone?
Second,
Number 8 is groundwater. Proposed activities shall not alone or in conjunction with existing activities adversely affect the quality or quantity of groundwater.
We had a statement, I think, from a well driller that there was adequate water, but I'm not
They put in
sure.
a new well, as I recall, at some point.
Yeah.
But I don't think there was any evidence that in and of itself would adversely affect the quality or quantity.
Right. So I'll make a motion to find that they meet the groundwater requirement.
Second.
Okay, motion second, more discussion? Number 9, municipal solid waste disposal. Activities shall not cause a burden on the town's ability to dispose of solid waste if municipal services are to be utilized. So my assumption is that they would use the municipal transfer station. They did make some kind of a statement about how a limited amount of solid waste would be generated, but it didn't strike me as being anything abnormal in that regard in terms of quantity or the nature of it. Sounded like regular municipal trash.
I'll make a motion to find that they meet that requirement.
Is there a second?
Second.
Number 10, oh, yes.
Sorry, Paul, I would just ask Chip, I just looked up the FEMA flood map because I was curious because it wasn't in the application. So there actually is a flood zone that runs through this property on the FEMA maps. So I would ask that Chip maybe confirm that. I just don't have enough time to do it right now. But somebody.
Does it seem to go up near the parking lot?
Yeah, it's in that turnaround area at the end, just past it, and also sort of above, obviously above the building. So it's not on the lower part of the property, but it's around the top of the property and at the end of the property too. Sort of curves around the bottom of the property, but not in front of the building.
Where you would expect it to be.
Right. Well, I would just say take a look at the map, but it is a federally designated zone of flood. So, and it's on property.
Okay. All right. So Chip, you can take a look at that.
Look at it right now.
Okay.
I can send you the link, Chip, if it's faster.
Okay. Number 10, this is about burdens on an existing public water supply. And there is not one. So this.
Make a motion that they meet this.
second,
Okay. Number 11, Adjacent land uses.
Make a
So,
motion that they don't meet it.
Second,
I
And
second it.
that's mostly because of noise.
um, let's see, there was noise. There were a couple of comments about visual impacts, as I recall. People concerned about visual impacts in both directions. You know, being able to look at the backs of the residences and the residences looking out onto the activity.
there's also dust and odor from traffic. Dust and odor are in there.
Mhm.
Visual impact thing, though, I mean, people can plant trees or shrubs or something. I don't know.
There's
I would agree, noise is the major one.
And foot traffic across the front of the next door residence, I think was mentioned.
Right,
Not just the noise, but the general, I guess, annoyance of it.
because it talks
Yeah.
about or other effects. So the other effects would
Yeah.
be people walking across.
Yeah, and I think there were a couple of people who mentioned things like trash,
Yeah. the
you know,
person
on their,
Central Road.
So, some of this is any development, any non-residential development especially, is going to create some noise. It's going to create some traffic, and with the traffic comes some pollution and all of that. I think what the board is getting at, and I'm trying not to put words in your mouth, but to write this up, is this is a very quiet little residential road with only, with one home very close to it, right? And that the impacts would be felt unreasonably because of that setting.
and I think some of the impacts, there were certainly comments, and we've had discussion about impacts to some of the houses on Old Kents Hill Road, which are not as close as the one residence that's located directly adjacent. But the noise impacts in particular were commented on by the residents on Old Kents Hill Road. So I think that it's more than just the one adjacent residence. Particularly with respect to noise. So is there a motion on this one?
I think I made a motion that they don't meet it.
Oh, you did, okay. And was there a second?
second,
Second. Any further discussion? Okay. 12, pollution shall not result in water or air pollution. And there are a number of considerations.
I'll make a motion.
Go ahead, Jack.
I'll make a motion that they meet it.
Anyone have comment about that? Is there a second?
A second.
Discussion? Okay. 13, water bodies shall not have an undue impact on any water body, such as a lake, pond, or stream.
Motion that they meet it.
Again, I think this is one where there were some general comments about potential stream impacts, but I think it falls into the category that Kristen was describing earlier about, any increased activity has the potential for that to happen, but we've not identified any specific aspect of this proposal that would cause that.
That's fair.
So Jack made a motion. Is there a second on this one?
Second.
Any further discussion? Number 14, wastewater disposal. Activities shall provide for wastewater disposal, meeting all applicable requirements. My recollection is that they have a new system, correct, Chip?
Correct.
Which is in conformance with the subsurface wastewater rules, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Wasn't there an issue about how they came up with, Don, you might remember how they came up with the capacity based on the number of, well, originally it was based on the number of seats in the pub, and then they had something for a dance barn. There were some standards for dance barns and number of gallons.
Yeah, my recollection is that it went back to a seating capacity, but right now it's a little bit up in the air with what is the capacity, but I think what we saw, we did determine to be adequate.
Okay.
You're probably again linked to the number of people that would potentially use the facility, correct?
Correct.
So we don't know how many people the septic is designed to serve.
We do. It was based on a certain number of gallons based on, I think, the standard of a dance barn or something like that. But I forget.
Chip, you don't recall what that capacity was, do you?
I'm looking back right now, wastewater.
I don't know how you can determine if they meet the disposal requirement if you don't know the capacity of this building. Maybe you don't know, the use of the building, right? They seem to be tied together. So I would say they do not meet the standard until they prove otherwise.
Or another situation where the information is not sufficient for us to draw a positive conclusion.
Fair enough. I agree.
I think it's either what Paula just said there, or one would have to go backwards from what they've proposed in terms of a system and what the capacity that would support, and then have a condition that limits any use to that capacity, which is a little bit harder to do.
I guess I'm looking at it more simplistically and saying the burden of that calculation and proof is on the applicant, not the town.
So that takes us to a motion that it does not meet the standard because of the insufficiency of the evidence. Is there a motion?
Make a motion, it doesn't meet the standard because of the insufficiency of the evidence.
Second?
Second.
Discussion. Okay, number 15, stormwater. Proposed activities shall provide for a stormwater management plan, comply with best practices, etc. And again, this is a situation where there's no new construction outside of the parking area.
So I would say we don't have the information we need on this one either, since we don't have a design for the parking area. So I would make a motion that this is they don't meet this burden because we don't have sufficient information on the parking area.
Okay.
Second.
I would go further than that, though. I would go, because we now are looking at a 200 by 230 foot parking lot area. We have not to this point received a stormwater plan for that area of parking. So, I don't recall seeing anything on that in terms of stormwater management.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay. So we have a motion and a second that 15, they do not meet the stormwater standard. Further discussion? Okay. 16, sufficient water. Sufficient for the reasonably foreseeable needs of the proposed development and no evidence of adverse impact to the quality. We talked about the water previously. They do have a well that was put in to serve the facility. And we had determined in number 8 that the proposed activity would not adversely affect the quality or quantity of groundwater. So is there a motion or discussion about this one?
I don't think there's any, I don't have any concerns about adverse impact on the quality of the water or, you know, anything related to that. But I guess, you know, to meet the needs, I'm not sure, right? I assume there's enough.
Yeah, linked again to the numbers of people that are going to be using it.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably fine, but there's no real way to determine that.
Yep, you're right. So either we accept the fact that they have a well that was installed to provide water to this facility and make a determination that they meet it, or another one where the information we have is insufficient to draw a conclusion.
There's one piece of evidence that was entered in early on. Of course, this was from an earlier application. It was submitted for this one, the Readfield Country Club Emporium. Appendix B, bottled water, PWS exemption form, and it has been established by the owner, contract signature, provided for drinking purposes. Bottled water provided for drinking purposes, bagged ice brought in off-site, no cups provided. This doesn't count towards restrooms. So
Yeah, that was part of an earlier application, not this, correct?
Yeah, this one says new well at 25 gallons a minute, which is pretty good flow.
Yeah.
It's like firefighting water right there.
That's right. Yeah.
I'd say they probably have adequate water now that I found that.
Okay.
I'll make
Anyone
a
else?
motion
Jack, go ahead.
I'll make a motion that they comply with the water requirements.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Number 17, traffic.
I'll make a
Wait.
motion that they don't meet it
Second.
because of the safety concerns raised.
And you're talking about all the concerns that, and we had this discussion earlier.
Right.
It is one of the site review criteria, but we had an extended conversation about traffic. So is there
Right.
anything else that anyone wants to add to that? Okay, 17 does not meet based on our earlier discussion. 18, legal access. Site shall have legal and reasonable means of access sufficient to meet all proposed uses.
I'll make a motion that they meet that criteria.
What about the pedestrian walkway from the parking lot?
Well, I think it would be
We've
questionable
addressed
whether
that in terms of the burden on the town. That's something that would be required for safety. And I think that goes to traffic as well. I mean, I've got a number of bullets that you've already talked about on traffic. That without that, it would be unsafe. And they don't have the legal right to install it. Therefore, the obligation to do so would fall on the town.
So,
I think this is really getting to, do they have legal access to the property? For instance, if this was for, if they just had an easement across somebody's land for a single family residence, and then they're proposing to do this use in that single family residence, they wouldn't have the scope of rights they need in order to get there.
so you're looking at this one as just addressing the broad legal right to access the property versus the other attendant problems with traffic and pedestrian safety and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, another example would be if it's a large subdivision and it needs 2 ingress and egress points, but they only have established rights to 1 right of way into it, then they wouldn't have established a standard.
Okay. So
I'll make
that
a-
argues for meeting the standard.
Yes,
Right.
I'll make a
Yes, I
motion
like-
that they meet this criteria, that they meet the standard.
Is there a second?
Second.
More discussion? 19, impact on adjoining municipality.
I'll make a motion that they meet it.
Okay,
Second,
more discussion? 20, life and fire safety. This gets back to the fire chief's comments. I mean, this says may require a review by the fire department for life and safety recommendations and may require incorporation of the life and safety fire recommendations in the application or as a condition of approval. So we have such recommendations. But we've determined that one of his recommendations is not achievable because the walkway would have to be in part on property that the applicant does not own. So to me, that argues that they do not meet this standard. Others have thoughts on this one?
I think it's a, it's a fire department call, but I think it depends specifically on the use in the building as well, right? Like you don't know what activity is being performed. Therefore, I mean, if they're, for example, I have no idea, but if they're doing large amounts of cooking, then, I don't know. I'm not sure what the standard, how you judge the standard specifically.
Well, what I was thinking about was the standard that the fire department actually commented on, which was about accessibility to emergency vehicles. And that's the context in which they
Sure.
recommended that 10-foot pedestrian walkway be constructed.
Yep.
So one way to handle that, I would think, would be to say that as a condition of any approval, they wouldn't be able to use the off-site parking area unless and until that sidewalk is constructed. And then it would be incumbent on them to either convince the town to fund that project or to acquire the rights they would need to be able to put that sidewalk in. Until they can do that, they can't have people walking along there. It would be unsafe.
And so at this point in time, they do not meet that standard.
Right.
Correct.
Make a motion, they do not meet the standard.
Second.
Further discussion? 2021, proposed activity or development is not on property currently in violation of any requirements of the ordinance. So my assumption, Chip, is that there were violations, but there are no current violations because the building is not occupied. There is no occupancy permit, but the building is not occupied.
Occupancy for the building at this point.
And there are no other violations, correct?
There have been violations over the past year when there were gatherings without a CO, current certificate of occupancy, which had to be followed up. The violations were written up at that point.
But not currently in violation, which is the standard in the ordinance.
Again, no certificate of occupancy, nobody's supposed to be in there doing anything. So, no.
I'll make a motion that they meet that standard.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion. Okay, 22, obviously there's no timber harvesting going on.
I'll make a motion that they meet it.
Second,
Discussion. And road construction, proposed road construction, there is none.
I'll make a motion they meet it.
second,
Discussion. So let's go back and take two votes on these. So we would need a motion that the applicant meets standards 1, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 16, 18, 19, 21, 22, and 23.
so moved.
A
I'll
second?
I'll second it.
Okay, any discussion? I'll call a vote.
Can I just say
Henry?
something?
Yes.
Could you hold, please? We're in the middle of a vote, and I'll get back to you after that.
Right, it's regarding one of your articles, one of your criteria.
Okay, we're in the middle of a vote, which I'm going to finish, and then I'll give you an opportunity to comment. Henry is yes, is that correct?
Correct.
Jan,
Yes,
John,
Yes.
Bill,
Yes.
Noel?
I will not be voting.
Oh, that's right, you're not sworn.
I'm gonna abstain
Not
this time.
voting. I'm sorry.
Jack,
Jack,
yes.
Bill Buck, and Paula, yes. Okay. Okay, was that Alex with the comment?
It was Leah, but I can answer.
Leah,
it.
okay.
Got the information about the septic if you guys want it. The capacity from the engineer.
This is an engineer's report.
For 3 employees, 251 seats, so 301 people. That's what it's designed for. So it's probably more than covers it. Limiting factor for the design is the tank capacity, which needs to be 150% of the design flow. I don't know what any of that means. I mean, does that answer your question?
Yes,
You want-
yes.
Is that from something that the board already has in the record? In there, but I just couldn't find it, so I found it in my emails.
That must be in the in what they submitted, I would assume, Chip, concerning the new system. I mean, that would include the information. I mean, the form would include the information about the capacity and so
Yeah,
forth.
Also, I thought that would be.
I don't think it's new information, though. I think it's,
No, it's in your report. It's old information.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's new information. I think it's in the record.
Does the board want to reconsider that particular finding then?
Number 14.
Um,
Noting that we still lack an upper limit of the number of potential attendees at guests at
Yeah.
events, but
yeah,
Question has kind of already been answered. So, I mean, there's no way we're gonna have 300 people there. Then we don't want that. We kind of answered that before about capping it off and doing tickets. So, I mean, I just feel like that capacity is like more than covers the amount of people we would have there.
okay, board members, what are your thoughts on that? 300 people, you know, we can modify it and say that it meets number 14. And what we had said earlier was that there was not sufficient information to make that determination, so.
Based on that information, I would be willing to reconsider and make a motion that we reconsider and find that 14 has been met.
Seconded.
Okay, so it's a second to Don's motion to reconsider. I'll take a vote on the reconsideration. Henry,
Yes.
Jan,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bill,
Yes.
Bill Buck, and Jack,
Yes.
and Paula, yes. Okay, and so your second motion, Don, was to change the board's conclusion on 14 to meet instead of not meet.
That is my motion.
Was there a second?
Second.
Okay, motion and a second. Discussion.
I would just note for the record that it's found to be met based on the applicant's representation that the use wouldn't exceed the stated capacity to serve 351 people.
Okay, so I'll call for a vote. Henry,
Yes.
Jan,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bill Godfrey,
Yes.
Bill Buck,
He's on mute.
Bill,
Bill, you need to unmute.
I'm assuming, I don't know if everyone saw the chat from Eric, but I'm assuming he can't properly participate for some
oh,
technical
okay,
reason.
I didn't see it.
That's probably why he's not in any of these votes.
Okay. Jack
Yes.
and Paula, yes. Okay. And finally, we need a motion that the applicant has not met standards 2, 4, 5, 11, 15, 17, and 20.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion?
Did you say 15?
Yes.
Yeah. Do we need to carve out number 5 because that was for inadequate information, or are we just lumping them all in together?
I think we're putting them all in together because the net result is the same for different reasons, but. Okay, we have a motion and second. Any other comment, discussion? I'll call for a vote. Henry,
Yes.
Jan,
Yes.
Dawn,
Yes.
Bill,
Yes.
Jack,
Yes.
and Paula, yes. Okay. So we are at the end of that exercise, and Kristen, I don't know if you have any concluding comments that you want to make. I just reiterate that Kristen is going to support us in putting together some initial findings of fact for our review and discussion at a later meeting. And so we will revisit these issues at that point and look at the specific findings of fact that would accompany the conversation that we had tonight. That may lead us to a decision on the application, or it may not at the at a following meeting. I think we need to see how it plays out and what the issues are that we wind up discussing when we look at the draft. Kristen, any comments?
You'll all hate me, but I'm wondering if we should go through the Article 8 standards, which also should be part of the review, I think. Almost all of these are not applicable, but there are a few that are. So there's Section 15 about lighting. Section 16, there's commercial, industrial, and institutional standards. This is an institutional use. So we'd want to make sure that those are met. There are provisions about parking areas and traffic access. There are also in Section 19, the Resource Protection District standards. I think everything in the RP, I don't think none of that's going to be triggered, but yeah.
I assume, Kristen, that you would agree that we had sufficient. Well, we didn't take a vote, but we had discussion around the non-conforming structure piece.
Yep.
And that there had been mention of that broad standard in site review, and that's where that would be housed, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
The Section 19 stuff is really more about roads, clearing of vegetation, stuff like that. None of that's really going to be applicable under this standard. I think, again, that falls under the, does it comply with all the ordinances catch-all standard.
Yeah, okay.
But so the lighting, parking areas, and traffic, and Section 16, which is the institutional standards. So if you could indulge me for maybe 10 more minutes here, and we'll go through these to see if there's anything that sticks out as being not met from these more specific standards.
I'm sorry, Kristen, which section are you in? You're in 19, is that correct?
Well, 15 is lighting, and I think that's the first relevant one.
Okay.
Page 57.
Yeah, page 57.
So the standard is the development shall have adequate exterior lighting to provide for its safe use during nighttime hours, if such use is contemplated. And sounds from what you were saying that there was no specific proposal to add lighting, correct?
I do not recall a specific lighting proposal.
We do not have a lighting plan, no.
They talked about lighting along the trail or something.
Right. In a general way, lighting that would connect the trails with the building.
And I think they talked about lighting of the building on the outside.
You can feel free to ask the applicant to point to anything that's already in the record if you're at a loss.
So Was there in fact something specifically that you recall, Leah or Alex, in the application that dealt with lighting standards?
I don't recall anything. I don't either.
Okay. All right.
And you all
I
had
don't
touched
recall
on
any.
the issue of, you touched on the issue of lighting between the offsite parking and the facility. Lack of lighting and safety issue.
Yes, that was raised. Was that you, Henry, that raised that issue?
That was me.
It was Bill. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Something that's consensus, a concern for the board.
Yes.
It sounds like you would find that this standard, particularly A, isn't met because there's not sufficient lighting to provide for safe access between the parking and the club, and lack of an overall general lighting plan.
So moved.
Second.
Further discussion about this one? Okay. It does not meet section 15.
And the next one, section 16, same page, is the commercial, industrial, and institutional standards. Solid waste storage areas shall be shielded from public view. We don't know where the solid waste is stored, do we?
No.
No,
And I think that's the only relevant one. There's no manufacturing and processing, so.
Shielded from public view, it is a sort of private
Yeah,
site. I don't know if that factors in.
so shielding from public view applies apparently to the solid waste storage areas as well as the processing and manufacturing areas.
Yep.
So, and we do not have information about where solid waste would be stored. So I would suggest that the application does not meet this standard.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? Okay.
So section 17, parking areas, and it's parking areas subject to site review. And so I think what that's intended to mean is if the parking area itself, in and of itself triggers the site review, that it has to meet the setback.
I was
no,
reading that to be part of the parking area is part of this proposal, and the proposal overall is subject to site review.
they should have actually put that lot number on the application, which I don't think they did, but they've made it part of their site review.
Independently, does it trigger the site review standards? Have to look.
If someone just came in and wanted a parking lot,
Right.
I don't. Geez.
We've reviewed other developments and parking has been part of them, and we've
Right.
looked at the standard.
I don't ever remember our considering a standalone parking lot.
Yeah, it's always part of a development.
Yeah. I don't think there's any question that it's, you know, it is part of this proposal.
And it's subject to site review.
It
Because
is certainly a subject of this site review.
Hmm.
I think there are definitely two ways of reading that. What I'm looking for right now is table of uses and to have parking facility on there. And it does not, I don't think.
Parking areas
Oh,
are
parking
listed
areas,
in the infrastructure category.
Yep.
And, you know, for the most part, it's CEO approval. But I guess I look at this one as part of a proposal that requires site review as being different than a standalone parking lot.
Well, now that I see that on the land use table, it's a parking area is almost never going to be subject to site review. Then it seems to suggest to me that what they mean is if it's part of a use that's being subjected to site review, that it has to meet these criteria. Is that what the board is leaning toward as well in terms of the right interpretation?
yeah,
Yes.
So going back to that language then,
I'll make a motion that they don't meet it.
Is there a second?
Second,
We didn't see whether they met the setback requirements because we couldn't tell from the map. Don raised the issue of stormwater runoff. And we didn't know the spacing of the parking spaces. And also, we didn't know the parking area, the 19 spots on site. We know nothing about them, where they are or anything.
And there was the general issue of the design of the parking lot. We don't have information about that. And if it meets, you know, there's a typical parking space and internal travel aisle requirement in here. And we don't have that information.
traffic access, driveways and other required accesses shall be located to achieve the required site distance. This doesn't involve a new driveway, but it is a new use.
did we vote on parking?
What was that, Chan?
That's
Did
a
we
good
actually
point.
take a vote on parking? Did I miss that? There was a motion and a second, but did we vote?
You didn't. I blew right past it. Go ahead.
Okay, you didn't want to vote on these as a block, because we didn't vote on
Lighting.
That's right.
yeah, I thought we would do them
Okay,
we do them all
as a
together?
block at the end.
Okay, fine.
So, so it is a new use, and issues like I would assume that things like site distance would be an issue with a lot of additional traffic. There isn't a new driveway or a shared driveway, but it does talk about it suggests that they're being built, and in this case, they're not being built, but they are going to be used in a different way. So that point of access will be receiving a lot more traffic. It does say applicability, the standards contained in this section shall apply to all development that requires site review. So I guess that suggests that it would be new construction.
Development includes new uses as well.
Okay. Well, we have a definition of development which says any man-made changes to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to the construction of additions or improvements to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavating, or drilling operations, sewage disposal systems, or water supply facilities.
I stand corrected, but it is sort of troubling to think that you could have an existing structure that was used for a really, low-key use and then just fill it with a completely different use that changes things
Right.
significantly.
That driveway is not connected to a parking lot.
But we do have the overall traffic standard in the site review piece. And, maybe that's a place where we could talk about the impact on the intersection and a lot of additional traffic accessing that road from, the end of Giles Road. Maybe that's where it most appropriately belongs.
What are concerns about the intersection specifically?
Sight distance, traffic patterns.
That entrance, it goes from Route 17 onto Giles Road and then directly onto Millstream Road. And so if there's a lot of traffic, if there are a lot of cars entering or exiting that road, it would, I believe, pose some traffic concerns, in terms of, the speed of the traffic, sight distances. We haven't looked specifically at that issue, but those concerns come to mind. Other thoughts about this one? And I'm thinking that perhaps we won't take a vote on this one because of that reference to development and the fact that we could fold those concerns about traffic flow into the site review traffic standard instead and cover them there.
And then section 19, let's just take a quick scan through that. No construction within 75 feet. No proposed clearing or removal of vegetation. So there doesn't seem to be anything there that's applicable here.
Um,
Um,
The parking area, yeah, at the house would be new development per se, right?
yes, it would. Yeah.
So that parking area would involve some movement of material.
Well, material, excavation, soil. Yeah. Which piece are you looking at, Kristen? In
19B,
Yeah, 19D.
Oh, okay.
19D1.
Elsewhere in the RP district, the cutting, clearing, or removal of vegetation should be limited to that which shall be necessary for uses expressly authorized in the district.
Henry, from your quick look at that map, was the parking area wasn't in the RP zone, was it?
Yep.
It was?
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, part of it is.
Part of it.
Some of it is, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's unclear whether it looked like there was some parking proposed. I call it behind the building. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
behind the building, and yeah, that would be in the resource protection area. That's comes down the side.
Yeah. And so, yeah, potentially, I guess they would be moving soil there if they were going to be creating parking spaces. But
Yeah.
we don't know.
We don't know, but
Yeah.
I mean, it seems logical. You'd have to do something.
Right.
Is that area currently grass, is the question?
Is it currently what?
Grass or some other cover?
It might be. It was out behind the building. I don't remember what's out there. There is some grass out there, but
Yeah. There's grass. I think there's grass. There may be some small trees, but I don't think it's. I can't specifically recall. Up a slope. I know that.
So does the board feel it has enough information to say that the proposed parking area at the house would appear to include some vegetated areas in the RP zone that would have to be removed for the proposed parking?
And that would include grass?
Yeah, it's any vegetation.
well, it says soil, sand, vegetation, or other material. So it's anything.
Or construction activity.
Or construction activity generally. Yeah.
Well,
So
I'm
that
talking
would have to
about
be-
the second sentence of D1. Elsewhere in the RP district, the cutting, clearing, or removal of vegetation shall be limited to that which shall be necessary for uses expressly authorized in the district. So to the extent they are clearing any sort of vegetation to support a use that's not otherwise allowed in the RP district, in this case, a community center or club, then they're not allowed to have that clearing done there.
Okay. So it sounds like for
Yeah. So if we
several
take
reasons, the proposal doesn't meet the standard.
Right, so if we take the parking diagram that we can't really read, but we assume is what they're proposing currently, then it would not meet this standard.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second,
Discussion? Okay, does not meet. 19. So,
19 goes on for a while.
It does, but most of this relates to work being done within 75 feet. So that's probably not implicated here.
Yep.
So that looks. That looks to be it. I don't see anything else. Do you, Kristen?
I'm looking at roads and driveways, so that's F.
And I.
But we're still in the RP standards. F3, new roads and driveways are prohibited in the resource protection district, except that you may grant a permit to construct a road or driveway to provide access to permitted uses within the district. Sounds to me like this proposal here is really for a parking area, not a driveway or a road. But the other standard kind of addresses this about clearing for uses not allowed in RP.
Mm.
All right, parking areas. And I, like you said, Jan, so parking areas shall meet the shoreline and tributary stream setback requirements for structures for the district in which they're located. So that seems to be met because the parking area itself is not within 75 feet as far as we can tell, right?
Well,
No, it is.
It is.
Yeah,
yeah.
there's two parking areas. The one parking area that's at the end of Millstream Road this would not be a concern. The parking area that's up by the building that they've now proposed is the concern.
And it would appear from the limited information we have to be within the 75 feet of
Yeah.
Millstream.
Or at least a portion of it.
At least a portion of it, and it's certain, and the road parking is certainly in the proposed parking in front of the building is certainly in the resource protection district, which is a prohibited use. Parking is a prohibited use in that district anyway.
Right.
So it's covered under the other.
Cuts to the core of it in the table of uses. Yeah.
It's covered in the other standard.
All right, so to go back and summarize then. Paula, you're much better at this summary stuff than I am. So
Okay, so we
16
look.
we found not to be met. Section 17, you found not to be met. Go ahead.
16, 15, 16, 17.
Yes.
So moved.
Second.
And 19.
Wait, there's more than that though. So
There's
15,
more.
17, 18 you found was generally not applicable. And 19 you found was not met.
Right. So it's 15, 16, 17, 19.
Yep.
Not met. And that's what we need the motion on.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? Okay, I'll call for a vote. Henry,
Yes.
Dawn,
Don,
Yes.
Jan,
Yes.
Bill,
Yes.
Jack,
yes.
and Paula, yes.
Well, I've reached the end of my tolerance.
So
Me too. Second.
rest assured that we're not doing minutes. Sorry.
Oh, my goodness.
I reached the end of his rope too.
That's how I feel, Jan.
Yeah.
Sorry. He saw something out the window. So our next regular meeting is scheduled for the 12th of October. And I guess I'd ask you, Kristen, if you think that's enough time to get something in draft form together with enough opportunity for planning board members to review it, to be in a position to discuss it on the 12th, or if we should bump the meeting date out.
The only reason that I would say that is because I can't be here on the 12th.
Okay. Okay.
Otherwise, I feel like I could turn it around in time to get it to you all and still have probably a week to spare.
Yeah.
Do you have to meet on a Tuesday? Could it maybe be Thursday?
We do, you know, we've adjusted this schedule when it's necessary. So it, you know, we've met on Wednesdays before if need be. And I think it kind of revolves around, you know, the schedules of planning board members. Jack is going to be away. What is it, 2 weeks, Jack? Beginning
starting
on
the 14th.
Yeah, so that would preclude October meetings because I really would
What
like
about
to
the
have.
13th?
The 13th I was just looking at. Does that work?
Yeah,
Wednesday?
Would that work for everyone else? The 13th of October instead of 12?
For me.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's okay.
Yeah, it worked better.
Henry? Okay, so no issues with that. Okay, well, why don't we plan for Wednesday, the 13th then for the next meeting, which is the Wednesday. And we'll look for something from Kristen to review prior to then. So we're prepared for that discussion on the 13th.
Okay, I'm very sorry, but hidden on my calendar was something for that evening.
Oh, no. And it seemed too easy.
Yeah. Okay, I can move my thing on the 12th. So if everybody can do the 12th, let's plan for that.
Okay, you sure that works for you?
I think I can make that work. If it doesn't work for some reason, I'll be in touch and we'll try to find another day.
Okay.
We don't want to pass, you know, I don't really want to go into a third week on this, nor do I think it's necessary. So what I will do is draft these up, circulate them to the board, and I'll have instructions in that email, but I certainly wouldn't want anybody to discuss amongst themselves what's in them. But if you have something that you feel like I really missed and you want to shoot an email and let me know that, that's fine, because you know, we don't want to have to fully redo things in the next meeting if we can avoid it.
Mhm.
And I also want to make clear to the applicants that no official decision has been made tonight. So this doesn't start any appeal period or anything. The official decision will be on the 12th.
Okay. And, you know, I'd like to reiterate to the applicants that we certainly appreciate your attendance here, and I think it's important. And again, I just want to make sure that you understand the format for the meeting once we get to this stage of the discussion. And it's principally intended to be an opportunity for planning board members to deliberate. So I just want to make sure that that's clear to everyone. Does anyone have anything else? I would, I'm feeling like I want to offer the applicant, one brief opportunity to comment. If you have a comment you'd like to make at this point, we're not going to get into discussion, but I would open the floor if you have a concluding comment that you'd like to provide.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, did you not have a comment? Is that?
No, thank you.
Oh, okay. I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry. Okay. Planning board members, anything else? Okay. Thank you all very much for participation and patience and stamina. And we are adjourned. And unless we hear otherwise from Kristen, we will be meeting again at 6:30 on the 12th of October.
Okay.
Thanks, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks.
Just don't need to leave lock my keys in the office.
Hopefully.